All right, welcome to the talk, everyone. Today we have a guest from Vienna. This is Katta Spiel.
Oh yeah, I should probably stand.
And Katta is a PhD student at the University of Vienna.
At the University of Technology.
The Vienna University of Technology?
Yeah.
The University of Vienna Technology?
No, there are two.
Okay.
They're different universities.
All right. TU Wien, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I always mix this up when I try and do English things. But yes, the big one, famous one.
The smaller one.
Yeah. Totally
Not
famous
from the big
because
one.
of Geraldine.
Oh yeah.
Famous in HCI, anyways.
Super.
Okay.
I brought you Viennese cookies if you want to know what Vienna tastes like, because the thing that is
Yeah.
really good about Vienna is the food.
Yeah, I'm gonna open them.
Yeah.
Not because I want. Okay. It's always better when they're open. Then people start eating them. Vienna cookies. Yeah, I'll eat one. Let's just eat this.
It even says it has Austrian butter and eggs and stuff.
Austrian butter is the best.
Sure.
Anyways, maybe you should just give a little bit of background, and maybe everyone can just say, we'll do it a little bit more family style. Everyone can just be, hey, do you like that?
Yeah, just name.
Yeah, just like, hey, I'm this person, I'm studying X.
Something random.
And some random
I
detail.
love it when people do random details.
Cool. How about we start with a random detail
Yeah.
overview?
So, oh yeah, I even have a slide for that. Haha, now you know my name. First of all, my name actually means game and play, so it's a hilarious joke that I do this research. And it actually started out as a joke, but then, those things get serious. Here you can contact me via email or Twitter if you want to. I'm at the Institute of Design and Assessment of Technology in the Human-Computer Interaction Group at Vienna Technical University, yeah, they just changed their name. I don't know what the correct one is in English anymore. I'm with the Social Play Technologies project right now. That has nothing to do with what I will talk about. But there we co-design with autistic and allistic children, so children who are not autistic but might have other neurodiverse characteristics. So we design with those groups technologies that should facilitate social play. And a random fact is probably that I'm doing roller derby and my name is Tinkerbell, which is usually an icebreaker. Yeah. So I'll just go back to, this is my topic. I called it Eluding Experiences, the Broken Promises of Player Experience Questionnaires. And what I will tell you is mostly a story of how I've been using player experience questionnaires and how that came towards and how that resulted in me questioning the tool as such, and also like how it's being constructed as a tool, and the more ideas what these tools communicate between them and individually. So I will talk about different topics, like briefly we'll discuss experience as such, and then the promises experience questionnaires make. Then I will talk about a study with blind players and a study with Tetris. Then we'll revisit the broken promises, and then I want to discuss what now, because we'll see. I have some ideas, but I'm not sure. And there's a take-home message, which is, this is all very small, I'm sorry, which is that the critical engagement with the tools we use is paramount to their constructive use. So most of you probably know that, but I feel it's worth saying again. So let's briefly talk about experience. You probably heard of the term and you have your own conceptualization, but I felt it was good to just tell you where I'm coming from. So this is Karlskirche. This is actually my office. So I see this every day in different weather conditions and in different construction periods. Even like the first 2 years I was there, it was constantly under constructions, and every day I could see something new but it's basically just there for me. I walk by it every day. Sometimes I notice it, sometimes I don't. It's just there. So to me, that is an Erfahrung, so to speak. German, distinguishes between the two terms Erfahrung and Erlebnis. You probably know that. Which is, Hassenthal also did that. If you want to look it up more further, just look for Hassenthal's work. Yeah, and an Erfahrung is basically something that just, we perceive it and experience it through our senses, but it's everyday, it's somewhat casual, and it's not necessarily lingering or impactful, but it's still an experience. Like, we experience something, but it's like, well, just happens. Like, this is also, just happens, right? I mean, yeah. So, but what it can also be is an Erlebnis, which is what tourists have. Tourists come there for one day and are like, whoa, and you probably also like this. I don't know, you probably don't have this architecture here, right? It's a very old church. So it's a singular event, or a series of singular events that often occurs outside of the ordinary, and yeah, it's an exceptional experience. It's comparatively insightful and impactful, and it's lingering, it's worth to remember, and it's like a huge, big deal, basically, in comparison to the Erfahrung. But whenever I stand in front of it and make a conscious headspace to interact with the building, like visibly, or like just analyzing it, or I visit a concert, it can become an Erlebnis. So through conscious reflection, I can make an Erfahrung, an Erlebnis, but it will never be the kind of Erlebnis that tourists have, right? So there is a difference in experience that is not necessarily reflected in the English literature. Just, yeah, for a background. And then there's also another concept of experience that called technology as experience. I love this because everybody relates to this picture. And there is a lot of technology in there. It's just really what we analyze. It's a kind of felt experience that is deeply situated. And the user is a social actor and not necessarily a singleton. So, for example, when players play with a game, they interact with that game, and the game reacts back. And there is a kind of interaction. It's essentially not just the player who has the experience, but also to some extent the game. To understand this type of experience, it requires empathy of a researcher, which is hard, like just as a forefront, this is hard to do in a questionnaire. And trying to understand, putting yourself in the player's shoes. What always remains, though, even if you do that, is some type of uncertainty, because you have always different life worlds from the people you watch playing games. Like, you have your own experiences playing games, and those feed into how you understand people playing games. It's not a problem, it's just, yeah. So there's lots of research on what can be games and play, and I'm not going to define that here, because, yeah, you all know probably the extensive work that is there. So I wanted to briefly just revisit the concepts through which researchers and then essentially also questionnaires are negotiating what constitutes a player experience. But just a fair bit of warning, I'm not going into every term you've ever heard in that connection. I'm just discussing the three most dominant ones. One of them would be flow, the so-called optimal experience by Csikszentmihalyi, where the challenge that a game provides matches the skills players have, or the presumed skills. So that's why, like, there's usually some learning of the game assumed, so that's why they get harder over time, for example. So it can be, it can be an aspect. So then there is presence of, like, being there in the game world, feeling like you interact within the game world more than within a physical world that you're situated in. Yeah, and it also reflects a notion of players who interact intuitively with the game because they feel like they're there. So disruption is kind of a problem with presence, but also with immersion. There we go. So, and a person is immersed basically if they completely accept the explicit and implicit rules of a game. That might be a somewhat, yeah, anyway. But if they accept the rules of the game and adhere to them. And it describes a very fundamental commitment to the game. You're basically in it, yeah?
So if that's your definition of immersion, how is that then different from the illusory attitude that
The what attitude?
the illusory attitude that Bernard Seuss describes in his book The Grasshopper, where he says you have to have this attitude, which means you're accepting the implicit and explicit rules.
Okay, I actually haven't read that. I have to admit that. I take that from Voss's work, who is unfortunately a German professor who only publishes in German. So I should update that. What?
That's the worst kind of reference, the German prof that I'm kidding.
Well,
That's awesome, but no.
I take what is available to me, right? So I learned French to read Foucault in the original language, so my spoken French is horrible, don't test me on that. So anyway, the promises that questionnaires make, and it's a really cool thing, is that we can understand the player experiences on a larger scale, which is important for commercial interests. It gives a rough stroke of player experiences, like where does a game go, which direction, and then you can extrapolate from that or ask further questions from your result. It's a quick assessment of self-reported values, like it's really quick compared to other methods. And then it also promises that they're comparable between studies that use the same instrument, which is a really, really cool thing. And I do love the idea of questionnaires there in that regard. It's clear that that we need more qualitative approaches for getting a deeper knowledge, but for understanding the basics of something, I find them really as a good starting point. So, yeah, behold, I will now post a list of instruments. Please don't read that table. It's just an illustration. Don't try. I've analyzed 10 questionnaires in my work, just the broad strokes. So the first 4 actually don't really are focusing on games, but they're often used in games user research. And then 2005, more and more player experience or more game-related questionnaires come up. It's often phrased, like the questions are often phrased in first-person language, and it's always a Likert scale, or Likert, I don't actually know. Likert? Okay.
German do, or Austrian do, I think.
Okay. And yeah, it's often 1 to 5. What is interesting in that is that only one questionnaire actually offers no middle position, and that middle position is often like it's criticized because it allows people who fill in the questionnaire to kind of not be committal to an answer. But I actually love that because that is a subversive point where your participants can just like reject the question, so to speak. So I will discuss 2 of them in more depth because I've used them in my own research, which is the Presence Questionnaire by Whitmer and Singer, and the Game Experience Questionnaire. And yeah, and these 2 then inspired the work that I have in this table and other tables. There will be more tables, but don't read them. So my first work was on blind players and text-based multi-user dungeons. I like exploring these types of experience through edge cases because they show where concepts break and where they need to be refined. So text-based games were a good choice because they're usable with screen reader software. They're programmed. However, they're programmed often by sighted developers, and not a lot of blind developers are there. There's a majority of sighted players, but there are also blind players who play between. But the other problem is that there's dominantly a represented, it's dominantly a sighted mode of navigation that is used, which means an allocentric mode that says north, south, east, west, instead of an egocentric move that says forward, backwards, left, right. So yeah. So I was interested in how navigation then, like how these different types of navigation would influence immersion and performance within that game. And blind players in those worlds have unique strategies to navigate because they, where that comes from is that it is research, there is work that claims that sighted people navigate more from an allocentric perspective and from landmarks, whereas blind people more navigate from an egocentric direction, which, yeah. So they experience the game from a marginalized perspective, and they have a desire to participate in the everyday game discourse. Like the people that I talked with were like, what they appreciated most about the text-based games was that nobody knew they were blind, or it was their choice to like reveal that or not. So they could engage with sighted and blind players without necessarily making it a topic. The text-based multi-user dungeon that I used was Discworld Mud. Full disclosure, I have been developing for that for 5 years. So that was like I knew the code base very well and was like, that's why I chose it. It's based on Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. Does that? Okay. It's actually it's a really huge game. Like if you're into that, I can just recommend it. It really feels like, to me at least, like exploring that from a different perspective, the whole world again. You can go to the bended drum and all these types of things. It's still in active development too, since 1992. Last time I logged in, there were like 80 players online, but that was during the day, and especially during the North American day, so it's probably about 100, 120 in the evenings, because I'm not involved anymore. So yeah. It has a dedicated player place. It has blind and sighted players, and it also had 2 blind developers in that course of the year. It most dominantly uses allocentric navigation, but those blind developers used egocentric navigation to make it harder for sighted players to play a game, to play parts of the game, and like to introduce a puzzle and a challenge in parts of the game, or rely on blind players to play it. So, yeah. I briefly already looked at, I should briefly talk about this map. This is Death's House, so those of you who've read it, who've read the novels probably know about that. So this is where Binky is, the pink square upper left, and then there's Alfred running around, and Isabel, and like here's a pond where you can fish, the skeleton fish and all that. That was the sub area that I've used because it has a very concise area. It has an indoor and outdoor navigation, so to speak. And you can set different quests that require people to go to different areas. And then I wanted to know, how do blind and sighted players perform in different navigation systems, and how immersed are blind and sighted players respectively in different navigation systems? Yeah. The tools I used were metrics like time on task and log-based interaction and command error rates, like how often were there typos or other errors. Audio, like think aloud, so it wasn't very loud, but I distinguished between in-game, metagame, and out-of-game comments, like just other conversations. And I used questionnaires. I used the immersive tendency questionnaire from Whitmer and Singer, and the presence questionnaire, and navigation questionnaire that I had built myself just to test in terms of like how people would then perform in different types of navigation if they just like how they retained the information of how they navigated through that space, like how they mapped that to their experience, yeah. So the problem was, that was still at that point the best one applicable to my research question, it felt. But the questionnaire assumes that players can see. And that there are graphics in the game. So what I had to do was I had to edit the questions, which basically eliminates the weak validity it's already based on. So unfortunately, I couldn't really use it in the form like that it's supposed to, because it just assumes a lot about what playing looks like and how players look like. Just in case you're interested, I have quick results of that study. Recruiting was really hard because the problem was to find blind players who would be interested to play but had no experience with text-based games. and spoke English, and I was doing it in Germany. Yeah, because if you're used to them, you can learn the allocentric way. So I didn't have a lot of participants. But sighted players made less errors in both systems. Blind players made a lot of errors in the allocentric system, like from the command error rate. In terms of immersion, blind players were more immersed in an egocentric navigation, and sighted players more in an allocentric navigation. And in terms of learning to navigate, blind players needed more time to learn an allocentric system than all other players, than the other players in other systems. They were faster in, blind players were faster in egocentric systems, and sighted players were but equally fast in both systems. In terms of the questionnaire and its assumptions, I found that the validity, there is a huge argument actually between papers about that questionnaire and its validity and what it actually tests. The development context is very different from what I did. It's a virtual environment that is very, it's as far as I understood, it's from a military-based research, so it's very VR-oriented. And the validity is assessed through internal consistency, so it's not a very strong validity assessment. The target population where it was tested on was military academy students, a sample of 152 students with a fairly okay gender ratio, I guess, but it was just students. And different modalities or disabilities were apparently out of scope for that research. And in terms of what they expected from games was that there was a game world and that there was touch, video, audio, and manipulable objects. They expected a lot from a game to have, which is apparently necessary to establish it to be a game. So, but did I have an alternative in that regard? And I would say, maybe. Don't read all of this. Maybe, but not necessarily. There are, internal consistency is used in 3 of the 10 questionnaires as an argument for how valid it is. The sample sizes of the questionnaires are highly variable. The gender ratio is really difficult from the participants they used. Over all of these, there's a gender split of 36% female and 64% male. And the US gender split is 41% female gamers and 59% male, so there's a representational issue. But the more representational issue is actually when you look at the average age that the participants in these questionnaires have, it's 21 years old, whereas the average age of a gamer in the US is 35. So I feel there is a mismatch on which player, on who we use to establish the validity of a questionnaire. So, but let's continue to the GEQ and how it broke my heart. I did research with Tetris. I really loved Tetris, but it was apparently too old school to be considered a game. That's, we'll see. I love Tetris because it was modifiable. I had a recent Kai paper on adaptation along different block choosing algorithms in Tetris. You can also adapt to speed. That is the more common way to adapt to it. It's easy to implement, which is nice for me, I guess. It's an experimental playing field for different input modes. And I used eye movement based adaptation here. And the other thing is it's well known. It's easy to find participants if you just say, I have a study playing Tetris, are you in? And people are like, cool. It's I don't know. At the university I was at back then, that was Bauhaus University, the CS department studies were always cognitive studies or perception, where you basically looked at a bunch of different couches and had to assess whether the texture rendering is good or whatever. So that was a really, people were enthusiastic in participating in my study. Also, I brought cake. I like to bribe people with food. So there are also different sets of different levels of expertise available. So when you have a set of players that that you collect. You have players who played it a lot and players who just knew of it or played it a little, and they have different levels of expertise in playing it. And even if I had one participant who had never played Tetris, but even then they had a pop cultural knowledge of what it was about. The player was very young. Just doesn't. Yeah. So even inexperienced players know Tetris, so that's cool. And in terms of eye movements, it's also fairly established where people look when they're playing Tetris well. That's work by German, like with the J. And others from 2010, so there's a clear mapping of where and how players look, like at the current piece for direct manipulation, at the contour down there for placement, whether they look calm and calculated versus hectic and hasty, focused versus distracted, and horizontal versus vertical. So I was wondering, what happens if I tell players that the game adapts to their eye movement and it doesn't, or it does? And what happens if I don't tell them and it does or it doesn't? Like, how do they experience the game? Is that clear? Okay. So the tools I used here were for performance lines cleared because the score based, because I adapted to different algorithms as well, I felt that a score-based calculation would be unfair, so I just did lines cleared. I looked at expertise in terms of eye movements, but I also had a pre-test that established expertise, and then the logs of the game. I looked at the eye movements. I looked at saccades, which are how often the focus is changed. At expert viewing patterns and how nervous players engaged with the game. Like, if there were very erratic eye movements, I could see that they were kind of struggling. And the questionnaires I used was the Game Experience Core Questionnaire. Players played Tetris 4 times. So in between, I used an in-game questionnaire for each singular game, and the post-game questionnaire, which had that question of, I felt guilty, and that was raising a lot of questions by the participants. I did not edit that out. I edited one question out in that one because it was about a narrative, and it was really hard to convince people that Tetris has a narrative, even though I would agree that you could establish one, but yeah. People were like, no, I don't feel guilty. So yeah. Exactly. The Game Experience Questionnaire requires a game to have some type of fairly concrete narrative, and I didn't have that, so I had to edit that question. Quick results of that study, just in case you were interested. Frame players focused more on relevant areas of the game, so if they were told that the game uses their eye movements, they were looking at the relevant areas more, so they were more in the game. Eye movement-based adaptation led to cognitively harder but slower games, as in the block choosing algorithm got harder, but they were slower. So it was not physically more challenging, but cognitively more challenging. Frame players felt more challenged with conventional adaptation, and I assume that's because the strategies that they had, because they expected the game to react to their eye movements, were not met. But they also felt more confident when playing eye movement-based games. So the assumptions it's a different set of assumptions that I discuss here for the Game Experience Questionnaire, is about the game, that there is an explorable narrative, that there are defined goals, that there's some kind of graphic design and aesthetics. There were a lot of questions which also raised eyebrows in participants in that area. I felt that in the development of the questionnaire, there's an unpublished paper, like a project report, where they describe the development for all kinds of stages. And they had still mostly white, they tried for diverse groups, but they still had mostly white male students in the focus groups. So in the defining of the questions, white male students were dominant in getting an understanding for how people play games. And same in most tests. There's a positive about this. It's the only questionnaire which does not only ask for positive player experiences, which is kind of like why I wanted to use it, because it has scales of negative affect and tension. And social elements are optional, which is in a lot of questionnaires they expect you to have a social component, but Tetris really doesn't have a social component as such. And what it doesn't do really is, because Tetris is a very casual game, it's not necessarily an Erlebnis, it's more like an Erfahrung. It kind of asks for larger, grander experiences than they were actually happening. So it doesn't, I felt it was a little bit off for casual experiences after the fact. So, but did I have an alternative? And here I would really argue no. Don't read that. It's, I can send you that if you want to. But it's basically all these questionnaires expect a lot of games, and they define games differently and what makes a game. But yeah, a lot of them require game worlds, storylines, narratives, or assume a real world likeness, which seems kind of counterintuitive to me, why a game should be like the real world, because I could just interact with the real world then. Like, and I use the word real here very loosely. A lot of them expect graphics or audio and so on. Other than a critique, I feel that this table is also really useful to cross-check whether a questionnaire you have, whether a questionnaire might answer a question that you have or might fit to a game you used, because you can just check, my game has all this, so this questionnaire is appropriate or not. So that's the second thing of what, like the critical analysis also led to a kind of like an overview of questionnaires according to different aspects. So what are these broken promises? Getting to the end here. In terms of validity, I feel that the scientific analysis of most of these questionnaires is quite incomplete. There's an issue of representation in developing and testing them. And there is a missing semantic analysis in most cases. There is a description of how the items are developed, but there is less of a discussion of what is actually meant by fun, for example. And I feel we have to ask these questions as well. Then in terms of games, there is a domination of first-player shooters in the development of these questionnaires. They often expect graphics or narrative, winning or losing a game, and I feel that not every game is about winning or losing. They expect the game to be consistent, which, you know, some games play with inconsistencies, and they expect also, not every, but across them, they kind of expect emotional content. So in terms of experiences, they expect grand experiences. They expect enjoyment, immersion, flow, presence. They expect an Erlebnis, even though some games just might be an Erfahrung. So what about other player experiences? So, what is missing is I'm just reading that up because it's so small. What is missing are conceptualizations that include more mundane player experiences in casual games that are properly validated and discussed, and whether a new questionnaire is the answer remains to be seen, but current ones do not deliver that. So what now? I don't really know, and I can always cite Heinrich Kleist, who says to point out a problem is a different skill than finding a solution. So, but I was wondering, should we have more questionnaires? I'm not sure. Different methods? Well, questionnaires do have their advantage. And going back to the drawing board and validating the questionnaires properly, sure, that would be an approach, but such a thing is not really appreciated in the scientific discourse of the field, so it's really unrewarding. So what do you think? That's the end of my talk. Yeah.
I was just thinking that and put it into a phrase. And, okay, great. Let's discuss. In terms of problems versus solutions and finding one versus the other technique, I find this is just an opinion now. I find there is this strange disconnect where if you have let's say a commercial goal, if you are a commercial studio, when you run your user experience tests, you are trying to improve your product towards some end. We are making a casual game, or we are making an MMO, or we are making FPS. So we have a target demographic, we have a target market monetization scheme, or whatever. I often find, in contrast to that, at conferences like I Play, for example, there's this attempt to go for like the overall truth of like, games should be this. What is the definition of a game? On a separate note, I'd be curious why Tetris is too old school to be a game, or why you put that title up there. Anyway, but so in terms of where do we go with questionnaires, I think it's kind of funny because some questionnaires dig at certain things, other questionnaires dig at others, and when one questionnaire isn't applicable to a certain game, or even to a certain goal with a given game, I don't see that as a problem. I just see that as like, this is the plethora, this is the variety that games can be. Tetris is no less a game than World of Warcraft. Is no less a game than Solitaire, right? So why would one questionnaire handle all of them? You know? So where do we go from here? I lean more towards, I'd rather the discourse shift to what are you trying to do with your research? What are you trying to learn? Like if we're trying to improve accessibility, well then we might have certain questionnaires for that. If we're trying to improve marketability, we'll have potentially a different question than that. But even that, as the words came out of my mouth, I'm like, marketability of what? To whom? What is your product? Who are you going for? Blah, blah, blah. Like it's such a multifaceted thing. I get very frustrated when a questionnaire tries to do everything. And I just say, like, stop claiming that your questionnaire does everything.
But those questionnaires do that. So they try to be super broad and like all encompassing, and that's then a problem. Yeah.
I disagree. I don't think they're trying to be all encompassing. I think it's more that the researchers are trying to struggle with the term experience, and they're trying to understand what experience means and how we can define experience, because it is an ill-defined concept, and a lot of the terminology that's being thrown around, such as immersion and flow, hence my question early on, is also defined differently in different literature. So since we don't have a standardization, we don't have a standard way of measuring these experiences, and so I think all of these questionnaires are attempts at trying to declutter the term experience and what it actually means to experience something, digital media, interactivity, fun, engagement, all of these things that factor into this. And so I think John does have a point when he says, okay, there are certain things that you have as a developer, so you have a certain target that you're trying to reach, and if you use the questionnaire as a tool that can propel you towards that target, that's fine. But I don't think that's the intention of these questionnaires. The intention of these questionnaires is trying to help us understand what it actually is that is a player experience, because we don't know, and we still don't know. We probably won't know for a while. We don't even know what fun is, like you said. Like, what the heck is fun? Nobody knows. Nobody knows how to define it properly. Fun is a bunch of different things for different people. And that's problematic, because that's the main claim of games. They're coming here to bring the fun. So what the fuck are games actually bringing us? We don't know, right? That's a problem.
Yeah.
And yeah, that makes the complexity of games. We don't actually know what we're dealing with here. Is it the big evil? Is it the great savior? We don't know what games are because we don't understand them properly, because we don't know how they actually work on us. Period. I'm done.
I don't feel that is a huge disagreement, but
I just like to start with like I disagree.
I'm not in disagreement with that statement. Yeah.
I just really like what you said about these questionnaires designing for the grand experience of like you're in flow, you're immersed, you have presence, designing for the ideal a lot of the ways, because how do you design a game to be just good enough? And we do that a lot in research. We're not trying to make the most fun experience or the most immersive experience. We're trying to make an experience that's like immersive enough that we can test concept X. And those questionnaires kind of fail in like getting you to like just enough.
Mm. Yeah.
Perhaps on a more personal, practical note, one of the things that I get intimidated by is this tension of like, we don't understand a lot of these concepts, and the admission of that, and the fact that like we're all flopping around in a very ill-defined space, is kind of it lends itself to like the imposter effect. Nobody wants to say that because we're all scientists and we're supposed to be hoity-toity good at what we're doing, right? but like it's a really complex space. It's a lot more complex in a different way than any, like I could walk over to the actual CS department, where incidentally there's this funny divide between the games institute and the CS department. Like, if I were doing a traditional CS, whatever that is, like I'd be like, hey, my compression algorithm is 74% better than yours. That's my result. Here, it's like, well, they seem to be, like, they got into flow a little bit more, but they weren't enjoying it. And we don't quite know why, and did it have to do with the aesthetics, the narrative, the presentation, the context, the marketing, how they were recruited, who they are, where they're at, you know, all these sorts of things. And like, it's very hard to go up against the rest, not even that language, go up against the rest of the scientific community. Join that process, the way they do it, with the stuff that we're trying to tackle. And so, questionnaires, just even the practical problem of going up against reviewers, right? Like, well, you didn't validate this, or this wasn't used, shouldn't be used in this context, or this wasn't designed for this kind of people. And I'm like, well, yeah, but nothing is. Like, everything is different all the time, and we should all just get on board with that, is what I'm arguing. But, like, that's not a strong argument for anything, right? That's what I'm
Yeah, as a public health student, I can really see that too. Like, I'm noticing there's a lot of compared to even some of the more regular health sciences like things can get very complex very quickly. And a bit off topic, something else, I really found your work with blind players very interesting. As a blind player myself, I'm actually curious, did you find any differences in those who had some sight before and slowly lost it, or those who were blind from birth? Like, I know myself, you mentioned the navigation systems. Personally, as someone, my sight's been getting worse recently, but I had some sight before, so I don't know if I'd have as much of a problem with navigation as someone else. And then it's really interesting too that you mentioned the text-based games were so big. I didn't even really know. I personally just tried to play sighted games and make them as accessible as I can. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. So I'll quickly go back and then I go to blind players because I think that is quicker. I feel that a lot of these questionnaires do try to appeal to a more core CS audience and have and are ultimately a bit of an exhibition of physics envy, so to speak. Yeah, where you try to like get a core answer in something that maybe like sometimes I feel that there is no way to embrace the uncertainty, and I would feel that would also be an approach. Like, we can on the one hand say that's an ill-defined concept, but we can also say maybe it's not, maybe it's just, something that doesn't have sharp edges, and that's okay. To blind players, so yeah, there is a difference for congenitally blind players or people who are blind later in life, in terms of navigation in general, but I don't know whether there was a difference in the games as such. I did not look at that difference because the groups were already really small. Like, seriously, I had 3 players per condition, so all of that is like with a hefty dose of take with a grain of salt, because I could not recruit a lot of blind players, and I had.
Very, very low incidence group, and then people who play games on top of that is very, very small. I know maybe 4 in Canada, including myself.
Yeah. So it was difficult to, and like in Germany, I mean, yeah, unfortunately the school system is very separative, so a lot of blind people just didn't know English. Which, yeah, I think there was one there, and then yeah.
So, cover a few things. From what the interesting point about how this kind of research is different from the rest of computer science, but that's not just about questions. It's a much bigger problem because one of research that we do is not actually just computer science. It's very multidisciplinary.
I think physics is a good way to
Yeah.
I like that.
And some people even say that social science is not computer science because of these types of problems, right? Because it's hard to be 100% sure when you're dealing with people because people have so many different styles. How much bigger problem? And we always have this kind of facility when we're dealing with people, but we try to get at least close enough to sanity. We're not very 100% sure, but we try to get close enough so we can say that something slightly could happen, right? Because that's what we're trying to get. And with this questionnaires of place experience, indeed, I would not see a problem of having a few different questionnaires that try to measure different things. I had some experience with the Game Experience Questionnaire, trying to measure a small game, and felt the same that was already mentioned, that questionnaire tried to ask for experience that were too big for that very simple game that we had, that the questionnaire would be more applicable to bigger games. So that might be an interesting problem. The solution, it seems, would be to develop a specific questionnaire for more casual or simple games, and that will probably be much useful for us as researchers, because we more often deal with shorter, small, casual games than bigger ones, just because it's much easier to only study with casual, shorter gameplay session, right? But it would be interesting to have both kinds of questions, because they
But then,
be applicable.
oh,
And
sorry.
you also mentioned something that people would not value going back and validating the existing questionnaires, but I would ask what you meant by that, because I think people would value if, because usually when someone publishes any instrument for the first time, they don't do big validation. They do a small first validation publish for the first time, but there's always space, and if someone then goes, sometimes even the original authors go into a bigger follow-up study, but even if they don't, someone else goes as a bigger study and publishes it, I think it's usually appreciated measures. And just as a...
I cannot keep more than two questions
Yeah,
in my
okay,
head right
okay,
now.
So,
But
yeah, I'll bring the other point later.
okay. So the first point was the casual games. I feel like there is some literature out there, but when we talk about flow being an ill-defined concept, at least we have a concept for these grander experiences, but we don't really have a good or consensual definition of the experiences of casual games. And I mean, part of that is rooted in that representational problem, because if you look at people who play casual games, you have a much larger female ratio, or like, since like very personal, since I have a child, I know how well casual games are. They're fantastic. If you just need 5 minutes to like, fantastic. So yeah. So there we would really have to go to a drawing board. In terms of being rewarding, so it's kind of twofold. Yes, there is one, on the one side, the community is really hard to get these papers published. I mean, in reviews I read, there's a lot of, this is not new, this is not new, this is not new. And there's a chasing for the novelty of things. And if you just replicate a study, then people are like, yeah, we knew that. And so there's, so in terms of, that's what I mean, like getting the recognition is actually harder than it might appear, even though I feel that is super necessary. But then it's also usually easy to criticize how it's done. Like, I do that myself. So, yeah. Do you want to go first and then you ask your third question so that others can also?
So first of all, I'd just like to address the fact that you use those questionnaires with 3 people in each group. I think it's normal to have a lot of dissatisfaction with the results from using questionnaires if you use very small samples. And as you acknowledge, there is measurement error. There might be some dimensions that don't address. So on the first 10, part of your dissatisfaction might be just you didn't use the tool for the specific job that you had to do. So maybe looking for stronger power can be a big improvement in the design. When you use a questionnaire, you expect that over large samples that you assess, you will nullify your error, your measurement error, and you might find something that's a little bit more interesting. I mean, although you did find some difference between the groups.
By the way, I agree with you.
generally. That's true of questionnaires. But I think the problem that Katta is trying to address here is that game questionnaires
Some of them
don't
are just
really have this powerful validity to begin with, that we can
Yeah.
say that a power of this extent can be
Yeah.
calculated to balance out the
Yeah,
questionnaires.
so that leads to my
especially the
second
GEQ.
question. My second question is that those tests tend to be multidimensional, and this is a problem that I also struggle with. When there's a dimension that doesn't seem to reflect a component that of your game, or just doesn't seem to match up, let's say tension doesn't work with cookie clicker or something like that, what would you suggest somebody does with that unnecessary dimension? Do they keep it in, modify it like you did, or just throw it away after the fact? What do you prefer?
Well, if I recall it correctly, the question about the narrative was in a dimension that I was interested, like in different studies. But the question about the narrative was in a dimension that I was interested in, but had like that one question that fell out. And I mean, I was analyzing according to dimensions, so this is why I can make statements about challenge and competence, but not about other factors. In terms of with the first study where I had really small n, yeah, I agree, like, of course, but I didn't know that when I designed the study, that this would be so hard to find people. And while I didn't go through a proper ethics approval like you do here, there was some kind of informal ethical approval, and so where they expected me to go through the study the way I designed it. So, yeah, but and I'm really glad that the other things also showed aspects of that.
Just out of curiosity, is there associations for the blind in Germany like there is in Canada?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they're also over-requested from researchers.
Yeah.
And if you come as a junior researcher, like that was one of my that was a bachelor's honors degree thesis, so
Right.
it was kind of
I know sometimes
difficult.
here they do things like sports sessions, like
Mm.
so it's an event where it's pitched as a social event, but it can be used for other purposes too.
No, Weimar even had a school for the blind, but I couldn't.
Yeah,
even.
just too much bureaucracy.
Yeah. Also because, I mean, children were in that school and they didn't learn English, so that was the game was in English.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, you mentioned school for the blind. Do all blind children go to schools for the blind there, or do they have integrated schools as well?
They starting integration now. It's slow. They're not necessarily like specialized schools for blind children, but there are so-called special schools for people with different disabilities. Yeah, I don't know. Do you know more? That's my knowledge of the education system. You had a third point. I did not forget you.
Yeah, no, actually the question is just a previous comment on a point. It's not more important point, but just your study focused on different ways of representing directions, right? And I just find it curious that this thing of representing directions with marks is fast. It's also, I believe, I'm not sure about it, but I believe it's also a cultural aspect, because I know it's fairly common in English-speaking language, I don't know if it's also in German. In Portuguese, where I come from, we don't do that. We use up, down, left, and right. So, other random fact about me, when I look at a game guide and it says, for example, you need to go east, I still need that fraction of a moment my head translates like east is right, because the way I'm used to looking at directions is up, down, left, and right.
Oh, okay. That's
Geographic coordinates, that's an interesting aspect as well. It seems that it depends on the culture and the language, just different ways that are more common than others.
That's super interesting. It also leads me to just mentioning briefly, I had translated the GEQ for some of my participants who did not speak English in the Tetris study. And that translation actually, at least within my study, was okay enough and it ended up in showing the same results. So yay, there's a translation. There was the person behind you first, and then I'm really not good with names. Oh, okay.
I just wanted to say GQ was already translated in several languages. So
Well, they didn't give it to me. Yeah.
put a lot of work into it.
I'm sorry.
It's also in the appendix of my PhD.
Was it even published back then?
No, but it's there.
It's also in the appendix of my master's thesis.
Probably. We should compare our appendices.
Totally.
like that.
Cool. I'm so thankful for your questions because, well, somebody said at some point that questions are love, and I really like the engagement that comes from questions, and it helps me articulating things that I couldn't articulate previously. So thank you.